All right. Thank you for coming here today, especially on a Friday. I know some of these Friday speaker series can be hard to populate, but this is a good crowd. So thank you for taking your time to be here today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Sims from the University of Tennessee. He is currently the director of the Center for Energy, Transportation, and Environmental Policy at the Howard H. Baker Jr. School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. That was my first challenge to get that entire name in his introduction. Dr. Sims is UW alum. He finished with a PhD in economics in 2009. I've always felt a good measure of a PhD is how well they connect with their department after they leave. There's a lot of business and economics folks here today, so I think that speaks for itself. I first met Dr. Sims as a colleague a couple years ago under the U.S. Department of Energy's Core CM initiative. That's carbon ore, rare earth elements, and critical minerals. There are 13 projects in the country. He is a fellow lead on the Southern Appalachian Basin Project. DOE puts us in these rooms, a little personal note, puts us in these rooms, conference centers, tries to get all 13 projects to solve big problems. That's a lot of smart people, not often with a smart thing to say when you're all jammed in a conference center for 48 hours or something like that. I took note immediately when Dr. Sims would interject an idea into those working group meetings. They were always intelligent, they were on point, and the course of those discussions would change almost immediately. And I would say that's a rare thing when you put a lot of smart people in a room who are trying to influence a discussion. So that was my introduction to Dr. Sims. I made a note there to follow his lead, put a little asterisks in those working group notepads I have, and try to follow those ideas that he was presenting and really avoid the inner workings of Core CM and stay with those big ideas, solve big problems. Dr. Sims will present some of that today, and I can't really say more without confusing what he actually works on. So, Dr. Sims.
Thank you, Davin, for the kind introduction. He's being nice. When I'm in the room full of the geologists, it's nice of them to humor my leads. They're talking about ore body structures and things, and then I want to talk about world trade, and they go along with me and humor me, so I appreciate it. I want to call out my graduate student here, Prabodh Prakash, who has done a lot of this work. I'm sort of following his coattails in a lot of respects with this. But to start off, just to give a background on rare earths in general. So why are we concerned about these things? These are, if you haven't heard, this is the stuff at the bottom of the periodic table that you never made it to in chemistry in high school. It was the stuff that you're like, that stuff doesn't really matter. It's the big atomic numbers. I don't pay any attention to that. But it's the stuff at the bottom that turns out to be super important for a lot of things that we consider vital for U.S. interests. You can see the uses here that run everywhere from earphones, maybe not so critically important for U.S. security and cordless power tools, but also for missile guidance systems, kind of important. And then the big concern here of late has been the role that they play in sort of renewable energy technologies. So wind turbines, hybrid vehicles, and then the batteries that go into those vehicles as well. And you can see kind of mapping those across through here. Now, they are strategically important because they have a big role in the U.S. economy. The other reason they're strategically important is that we are reliant on a number of other countries for our supplies. So you look here, you can see that historically the United States used to mine a reasonable amount of this stuff back in the early 90s. You can see then there the emergence of China. We sort of backed off, and then of late we've been trying to get back into the game. But you can see that we've had a period here where we were not producing a lot of this stuff and we were reliant on a number of other countries. All of these red dots represent where there are mines or potential mines. The mines are deposits, but the squares that you see are the actual economically viable reserves. And you can see that most of those are situated in China, a little bit in Brazil, not so much in the United States at this point. So I'll point out that this stuff is what we would say economically rare. It's not physically rare, right? It's actually more abundant in the Earth's crust than copper, zinc, and gold. What makes it rare, when you hear the term rare earths, is that it's economically costly to separate this stuff out, right? So it's not just sitting in a big pile under the ground. You have to do some fairly nasty and fairly costly processes to get it out and separate it and get it to the purity levels that you need. Okay, so how dependent are we? Well, when we measure RE dependence, we usually think about it as the domestic, the percentage of the domestic REE consumption that is imported. We call this the net import reliance. So in the past 20 years, 16 of those years, we've had 100% consumption of rare earths that have been imported. So that black dashed line you can see is at 100% if you're looking on this side, this axis, is at 100% for many years, meaning that every bit that we consumed was imported. You can see the prices here of several of these rare earths coming through, and most of the concern comes from the disproportionate role that China has played in those imports. Now, to give you a feel for what has happened here, you might be thinking, why did those prices spike? In 2010 and 2011, China put in export quotas. Basically said, we're not going to export beyond a certain amount outside the country. That supply shortage caused price spikes, and you can see that in the short term, that decreased our net import reliance because we had to rely on other countries, and we produce a little bit more in the United States. But that has come back up of late as the prices have come back down again. But of course, as economists, we get a little nervous about simple definitions such as the percent imported, because it's not the imports per se that are the problem. And it would suggest that if we really wanted to get to kill the import dependence, we would just minimize either the consumption of those goods, or we would just minimize those imports, which is kind of costly, right? We think of trade as having beneficial uses. So it's not the imports themselves that are the problem. We have to dig a little bit deeper. So what is the cost of this dependence? I kind of pointed out that it's not necessarily the imports that are the problem. As economists, we like to think of the problem is really that there's a market failure somewhere. And you can think of a market failure as just meaning that the price that we pay for these goods does not reflect what it really costs to produce these goods. As economists, what we love about markets is that they take a whole bunch of information about how people value things and the technologies that we use to produce them, and they collapse it all into this nice price, which is a really concise way of summarizing a bunch of information and allows us to make decisions. If that price is not a good reflection of what it costs to actually produce stuff, then we have a problem. So I want to point out, I've had several meetings with people when I say, what's the cost of RE dependence, they're like, well, we know what the cost is. I'm just going to take the price and multiply it by the amount that we import. That's what we pay for the imports. That's not the cost of the imports. You could say then that everything we buy has a cost that we would want to get rid of. What is the real cost is the loss of economic welfare that results from having these market failures, okay? So as economists, we want to differentiate between what did we pay for those imports. You're always going to have to pay something for imports. And then what's that cost that we didn't have to pay, that hidden cost, okay? That hidden cost can come from really three different sources for the REE case. One is imperfect competition. So imperfect competition just means that we have in this case, we have one dominant producer of this stuff, which is China. The second can be vulnerability to supply shocks. Okay? So there could be, in the case that we just saw, it could be that China puts in an export quota that creates a supply shock for us. That is also can be considered a market failure. And I'll dig into the specific pieces of that's a market failure in a minute. But then there's also the environmental externalities that I'm not going to talk a lot about today, but I do want to point out that the reason that China has this disproportionate stranglehold on the market is that they have laxer environmental regulations, right? They're more willing to tolerate lots of nasty processes that are separating these rare earth elements. And so by default, if we move some of this stuff back to the United States, we are also going to be taking on some of those environmental costs as well. I'm not going to talk too much about the environmental externalities today, but it does loom in the background. Okay. So the policy rationale, really what we're after here is measuring these dependence costs, because that becomes the justification for any sort of policy that you might have. So the United States has been thinking about, and the Biden administration has been thinking about, loads of policies, production subsidies or tariffs that would potentially help what they might call level the playing field, so to speak, so that there's less production coming from China, or we're less dependent on China for these critical minerals. The question then is, but what do we want to achieve, right? What do we want to achieve through this policy? Do we want to reduce overall REE intensity? That could be one objective. We don't want to use as many REEs in the economy. Do we want to discourage imports? Do we want to encourage domestic production? What really are we after here is really the next question that I'm going to try to give us a kind of 101 level answer to today. So just a little stage setting. About $541 million in in-use REE applications were imported into the US in 2019, okay? That's these numbers, that's these big boxes on the side here. You can see there's lots of in-use applications. The biggest one is magnets, right? So most of the stuff that's coming in from REE in-use applications is related to magnets. The majority of that is coming from China. You can see from the Sankey diagram, we get loads of that magnet imports are coming from China, a few from some other countries, but China is the big player here in terms of our imports for those end-use applications. The next question becomes, where does China get the raw material to produce these, to export these things? Well, China actually does quite a bit of mining of the rare earths themselves. As you saw, they're sitting on a large number of reserves. About 63%, China accounts for about 63% of the total worldwide production of the raw material, the rare earth ore. They then supplement that through international trade. So in 2019, there were 203 countries that actually imported raw material, rare earth element raw material, but no country in China accounted for more than about 5%. So China is the major importer of this stuff. The vast majority of those inputs come from Australia. The other countries in the top 10 that you kind of see here on the left accounted for about 2% or less. They're not big players, right? So you can see that of all the material that's coming into China, the majority of it is coming out of Australia. So now you can start to see the big picture of the world trade, right? China is producing a lot of the ore. They're then sending it to China. China's then mixing it with the ore that they're mining in their own country, and then they're basically exporting the vast majority of the rare earths, the end-use products. Okay. So that sets the stage that we are heavily reliant on China, right? Even though we have lots of countries here that are, somewhat producing this stuff, it's all essentially going back to China. China becomes sort of the bottleneck, right? So we can think about, what does that dependence on China cost us? This is sort of a simple way of thinking about this, okay? So in the first part, this type 1 up here on the left, this is changes in terms of trade, okay? So think of terms of trade as being how two countries would split the benefits of that trade, okay? So a change in the terms of trade just determines how we split the benefits, but it doesn't necessarily change the benefits, okay? So as economists, we say that usually the terms of trade is not something that we're concerned about, but it might be something that the US government is concerned about. I'm not going to talk about those changes in terms of trade today. What I'm going to talk about are the things on the right-hand side, these efficiency losses. So these are things that might be costs that are coming about because the markets are not working as well as we would like them to. You can then take that and split that up into two categories. You can have efficiency losses that are coming from the world rare earth element market overall. There's political costs that can come from this. Not going to talk about that as much today. There's also a loss of potential GDP due to imperfect competition. Now, people like to think of the rare earth elements thing that there's an analogy to OPEC, right? China is essentially the OPEC of the rare earth elements. It's not that simple. OPEC basically is a monopolist in the producers, so they ramp up prices and they charge us higher prices. China's doing the exact opposite, right? They're selling this stuff to us at the cheap, and they're lowering prices because they're trying to get a hold on downstream markets, right? They're not necessarily worried about getting market share for the rare earth elements. They actually want the market share for the motors and the magnets and the turbines and things like that, okay? So it's a little bit different. There is an imperfect competition story here, but it's a little more complicated than what we think in the OPEC situation, so I'm not going to talk too much about it today. The other efficiency loss and the other type of cost you can have is that other capital and labor markets, there's inefficiencies in those that cause problems. That can cause issues where supply shocks are going to cause income losses and GDP transfers or GDP losses in the US. So the supply shock itself is creating problems. And then you can also think about there's cost of mitigating those supply shocks, right? So we have a huge strategic petroleum reserve in the United States that is meant to do this for OPEC, right? We have a similar one that's being set up for rare earth elements. It's already set up for rare earth elements. There's a cost of maintaining those, but I'm not going to talk about those today either. What I'm going to talk about is this one right here. So just specifically, what we call the security costs associated with China or another rogue country strategically cutting us off from supplies and creating supply shocks. Okay, so I'm going to give you a basic 101 economics class here, and I may end up regretting this, but let's see what we can do, because there is a lot of hyperbole about this stuff, right? That we think we can't actually let China supply all of our rare earth elements, and I want to point out yeah, but weaning ourselves off of China is costly too, right? And there's a balance here, so just work with me. So think of this as first you got a demand curve. So if you remember back to your 101 class, the demand curve is telling us how much people are going to choose to buy at a certain price, okay? So think of this as the US demand for these rare earth elements, okay? I've got the quantity of rare earths here on the x-axis, the price on the y, okay? There's your world price of rare earths. That's then going to tell me how much in total the US is going to consume, given that world price, okay? Now that world price, as you can see, is predominantly set by China. They are the big producer. So they have a disproportionate role in setting what that world price looks like. But there are other players. We'll call them the rest of the world, okay? There are other players that are producing and have reserves on hand, and we can think about them as having a supply curve, okay? Now remember, the supply curve is telling me how much a country is going to supply at a given price, okay? It slopes up, right? Because the higher the price, the more people are going to supply, right? So now I can put this whole figure together, and I can start to think about breaking down our total consumption into imports from China and then imports from the rest of the world, okay? World price changes, that's going to change not only how much we consume, but the split between the rest of the world and China, okay? Now, I'll point out that if we were to completely wean ourselves off of China, we are only buying from the rest of the world, and we would be buying at that higher price, okay? So the first point I want to make is that China, because of their lax environmental regulations and lax labor regulations and whatnot, and that they are setting on a large number of rare earths, that they can sell at a lower price than the rest of the world. And so weaning ourselves completely off of China is going to be costly. We're all going to pay a higher price for those rare earths. Now, I want to remind you about the shock that we talked about earlier, the price shock. Okay, remember, China cut off exports out of the country for a couple of years in 2010 and 2011, and the price spiked, right? That created economic losses for US consumers, and we can show how that works in this figure as well by creating what we would call a short-run supply curve. Now, look at this short-run supply curve goes straight up. Long-run supply curve is sloping up, right? The reason it goes straight up is because in the short run, I can't ramp up mine production, right? In the very short run, after there's a price spike, I can't just immediately go out and put in a new mine, right? It's going to take 6 years or at least. So what happens is we go from consuming this total amount to lowering our consumption because now we are just reliant on the rest of the world. We're no longer reliant on China anymore. That increases prices. And so you can see there that the price goes up to that P star. And as economists, we can think about what that total cost to us as the US consumers as that green area, okay? Conceptually, that green area is representing the magnitude of those losses, both from having lower consumption, right? We don't have as many rare earths floating around in the market that we're consuming, but we're also paying a higher price for them, okay? So a couple of things. One, the supply shocks are not certain events. We don't know when they're going to occur. We don't know how large the shock is going to be. So it's handy then to think about these costs, that green area that you see there, as a security premium, basically like a top off on the price that we might want to include, recognizing that there could be a shock in any given period or any given year, okay? The security premium is not going to be considered an import decision. So we think of this as a cost that's not captured in the price that people are paying for those imported rare earths, okay? And then when I put all this together, if we think about national security concerns here, then what this means is that we are currently doing two things. We're consuming too much rare earth, because a lot of it's coming from a country that we might be getting into a war with at some point in the future. And then two, we're importing too much from China. Okay. Now, let's think about what that security premium might mean, okay? One, the security premium could be positive but relatively small. If we add that security premium to the world price, which is that red line right there that you see, that causes us to do two things. That causes us to reduce our total consumption a little bit, right? Because now the price that we're paying is a little bit higher. It also, if you see here, it's going to cause us to buy more from the rest of the world, okay? You can see that total area in red, the amount that we import from China, is now shrinking. It's shrinking from both sides, though. It's shrinking because we're now importing more from the rest of the world, but we're also lowering our consumption because the price is higher, okay? We're still importing, but you can see that if that security premium is small enough that we're going to see lower consumption overall, lower Chinese imports, but increased rest of the world imports. Now, if that security premium is very large, right, and it's larger than essentially that P rest of the world that you see there, then we're going to completely eliminate our dependence on China, okay? So as I pointed out, getting rid of China and pulling China out of this is costly to the US. The security premium is essentially what are the benefits of doing that, right? And if those benefits are large enough, then we can argue that we need to reduce our consumption and then rely only on rest of the world countries that might be more friendly, okay? So a key question that we have as economists then is, what is the size of that premium, right? If it's very small, then maybe there's very little justification for doing anything. If it's medium, moderate, then we need policies that are going to increase production in the rest of the world and decrease our imports. And then if it's large enough, we may be looking at a complete ban on Chinese imports, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about some work that Prabhu has done to estimate what these security premiums might look like for the US. We're going to use a model or use a method that was originally used to estimate oil security premiums back in the earlier part of about a decade ago. There's been a lot of literature that we have sort of pulled from that was thinking about oil security premiums back in the 80s and 90s that we've sort of resurrected to think through this problem with. The key things that we need to know to do the analysis, we need to know the rare earth element demand elasticity. So this is just telling us essentially how will demand for rare earth elements change when the price changes, okay? If people are relying on rare earths and they don't have any other substitutes, then it's not going to change very much, right? You can think about your own experience with gasoline, right? If the gas price goes up, you don't change how much you drive right off the bat, right? Because you got no other options. And so if you have to build an electric vehicle and it relies on a rare earth element and you don't have any other substitutes, then that elasticity might tell you that there's not going to be a lot of change in demand. The other is the supply elasticity from China. Now what we know is that this tells us essentially how Chinese supply is going to change when the price changes. we know that this is probably going to be pretty high. One of the things that we know is that China has about twice the production capacity that they need. And the reason they have this is sort of to protect themselves from new market entrants, right? You might think, why would they possibly have twice the production capacity than they need? They're waiting for the US or some other country to try to make their way into the market. They flood the market, the price falls, and then companies go out of business, right? So this is the key point that we want to make is that you think, well, why are there not other companies that are trying to get into this rare earth business if we're so worried about Chinese dominance? Well, the dominance means that they're starting well ahead of any private company that might try to bust into this market. The third thing that we need to know is the supply elasticity of the rest of the world. So if the price changes, how will Brazil respond? How will India respond? How will Vietnam respond? Those are going to be things that we need to know because that's going to tell us the degree to which the rest of the world is going to come in if the price does spike. And then the fourth thing we need to know is the probability and severity of these supply shocks. This is probably the biggest uncertainty for us right now because we don't have a ton of data on this right now. With the oil supply literature, we had a long time series of data telling us how OPEC was going to operate. The rare earth thing is a little newer, and so we don't have as good a data on what the probability and severity of these supply shocks might be. We're going to use three basic sources of data. One is the USGS data on mine production and reserve data. We're going to use this CEPI2 data on trade, so this gives us a whole bunch of trade data, and then World Bank data on the time series of US GDP. So for the economist in the room, everyone else's eyes may glaze over right here, but for the economist in the room, what we're essentially doing is we're saying that the expected total welfare associated with REE consumption, and that consumption is QC, is really made up of four pieces, right? It's the domestic real GDP. That's what we get from consuming rare earths. We then have import costs, which is just the world price times QM, which is the amount that we're importing. We then have to net off the expected future increase in RE import costs associated with those supply disruptions. And then there are expected future GDP losses associated with price spikes that are coming from those supply disruptions as well. We can work through this and we can show that if the market were functioning properly, the optimal use of imported REEs would ensure that the marginal GDP from an additional unit of imports is equal to the price, plus these other things here. And it's these three other things that become the motivation for thinking that the price might not be sending the correct signals about the dependence costs. The first one is the changes in the terms of trade for imported oil during stable market conditions. So this is when there are no supply disruptions. This green term is the changes in the expected import costs. So remember, the import cost is just the price, world price times the amount that we're importing. So what this is telling me is that as imports go up, that has an effect on the expected change in the price, and then I multiply that by the amount that I'm importing. And then there's a secondary effect on the expected change in the price itself. And then this third term here is the changes in expected GDP, right? So think of the Y as being the GDP. This is how imports are going to change GDP during a supply disruption, okay? So again, we think of this as economists as this is the thing that we're concerned about. Because if these things are not being incorporated into decision making, then we might think that this price or this world market is not functioning efficiently, okay? So I'm going to make the case then that there are really a few things that we need to worry about and a few things that we don't need to worry about. This first term here is, if you remember, this is this term here. So this is the changes in the terms of trade. As economists, again, we don't think of this as an efficiency loss. This is just how we're splitting the benefits of buying and selling rare earths. There's gains from trade, and it's basically how we're splitting them. In terms of efficiency, how we split them doesn't matter. Now, the Biden administration and the Department of Defense might disagree, but for efficiency considerations, this isn't a concern, and so we're not going to talk about it today. The other thing that we're not going to worry about is this term. Supply shocks, firms should expect that supply shocks are going to happen, right? They're not completely ignorant of this. And so this term in particular is just recognizing that when supply shocks happen, there will be a change in the price. Anyone who's buying rare earths should expect that. So we're not going to think of that as something that's not going to be considered by firms. We think that firms are forward-looking and paying attention to the probability of supply shocks. That leaves this term, which is just saying that when there's a supply shock, if I import more, if I'm a company, say I'm Ford, and I'm producing electric vehicles with rare earth elements, let's say that I'm importing more, I don't recognize the fact that increases in my imports has cost and impacts on the overall global economy, okay? In other words, this is showing me how the price is going to spike when there's a supply shock. This is talking about the economic hurt that comes from that supply shock. And in this case, a single firm is not going to recognize that their increase in imports may be causing harm on the rest of the economy, okay? So we think that this is something that might be missed. And then we think that for sure that most firms are not going to think about the effect of their imports on GDP, okay? So that causes us to then focus on the security premium as being these two terms up here, and then multiplied by these probabilities, which are the probabilities of a shock itself, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we can then think of summing the security premium over all the shocks in that we would see. Each shock has a different probability. And then this delta Q is the size of the shock. So where does this phi term and this delta Q term come from? Well, I'll get to it in a minute. The first thing that we'll talk about just briefly is we had to estimate a number of the elasticities. You remember we needed a world elasticity, world demand elasticity, a rest of the world supply elasticity, and a Chinese elasticity. We collected some data. We estimated these elasticities using some very simple models. We got all the signs that you would possibly expect. The key ones to note here, world demand elasticity is negative. I hope so. So the demand curve is sloping down as we would expect. The two supply curves are sloping up, and these become measures of our elasticity that we can then use moving forward. So the key thing to take away here is that, as we expected, the Chinese supply is much more sensitive to price changes than the fringe or the rest of the world supply. This gets back to that notion that China has a lot of excess capacity. They can ramp up production if the price changes pretty quickly. Okay. Okay, now back to the probabilities and the size of the disruptions. As I talked about, we don't have good data on the size and the magnitude of these supply disruptions at this point. What we did is we took a table that was looking at the probability and size of supply shocks from OPEC. That's essentially what this is. So it says that annual probability is very, very high that there's going to be no supply shock at all. And then as the supply shock gets bigger, 85% of REE production, the probability goes down. Okay, so in other words, there's very little there's a very high probability there won't be any shock, and then as the size of the shock gets higher, the probability goes down. We used these just for exposition because we don't have a good way. This study back in the day was using expert judgment. They interviewed people who'd been working in the oil and gas industry for 40 years and asked them what they thought the probability of a shock was, and we haven't been able to do that. But what I will say is that these numbers here imply that the annual probability of a shock that we saw in 2010 is about 0.00025, right? So down here somewhere. That would say that this is the shock that we saw in 2010, where China just decided to put in massive export restrictions in, is a pretty low probability event, okay? We can go back and adjust that, but this is the assumption that we're working off of. When we put all that together, we then have estimates of these security premiums. Okay, now I've got lower limits and upper limits here because there's lots of uncertainty that go into these calculations. But you can see that it's split up into the change in expected transfers that we talked about and the change in expected GDP losses. The GDP losses are the bigger component. But you can see that if we put those two things together, those security premiums range anywhere from less than $1 to almost $4. Okay? The other thing to note is that they change over time. So you can see here that the premium peaked around, what, $3.70 some odd cents. This was after those import restrictions went in, right? So this makes sense. Prices were high, and so the security premium costs were going up during that period immediately after the export restrictions. And then as those export restrictions were lifted, prices came back down. We had more people producing, more than China. We had other players in the market. The security premium went back down. This is showing the same number just in terms of the percentage of the world price, because the prices are changing here as well. And so you can see that the premium ranges anywhere from about 2% all the way up to about 23 or 24%. But it's leveled back out now to a little less than 10% of the price. Okay? Yeah. How does that match up to oil? The oil security premium was about 25 to 30%. Yeah, so the question was, how big is this security premium relative to the premiums that we saw with OPEC? The OPEC premiums, I believe, were about 30 to 40%, depending on the year. Part of that is because oil is just such a massive part of the economy. These rare earths are, we think they're going to be important, but they're still a relatively small component of the overall U.S. economy at this point. So that shields us a little bit. I think the supply shock that we saw in 2010, 2011 was probably a bigger shock than we've seen with OPEC. OPEC does some kind of marginal shenanigans with things, but the supply shock was probably larger, but I think the overall impact of rare earths on the economy is much less than oil. So what does all that mean in terms of policy implications? Let's think back what this might mean. So again, that security premium ranged from about $3.75 to about $1.90 over the last decade. It's unlikely that this is going to justify a complete move away from China, right? So remember that we needed the security premium to be greater than this difference. In other words, I tend to believe that if we completely got rid of China out of this market and we relied on every other country to produce rare earth elements, the prices would go up by more than this, right? And so if you think that's the case, then probably where we are is we're in this world where the premium is positive but not so large that we want to completely wean ourselves off of China. We want to reduce consumption overall. We want to increase a little bit of imports from the rest of the world, which tends to crowd out Chinese imports. But the question is, how do we do it? One thing we could do is we could subsidize supply either domestically or in the rest of the world. Now, if we think about what this means, what that's going to do is take that long-run supply curve and shift it down, okay? That will lower imports on this side, but it will increase the long-run domestic supply, which is good. Import share of total consumption is efficient, but the overall consumption remains too high. We're still consuming too much. And this is going to drain the domestic supplies and the supplies of our rare earth partners faster. The other thing I'll point out here is that at any point, China could flood the market to regain some of that market share. So China could essentially just ramp up production since they have all this excess capacity, which would lower the world price, and that would claw back some of the market share. They would be importing more. So you're going to get into a tit-for-tat situation with China at some point. The other thing we could do is we can impose a tariff on Chinese imports equal to that security premium. So what that would mean is that now importers would pay the world price plus this tariff, which was the security premium, and essentially this would internalize then those externalities I was talking about. All those things that consumers weren't considering when they were making their decision to import the rare earths, they would now be considering them because they would be embodied in this tariff. The price would then rise to what we would consider the appropriate level. Consumption and imports drop to optimal levels. The government's going to collect revenue from the tariff, and then producers are going to bid from higher domestic prices. You can see that our rest of the world partners here and many domestic producers are going to benefit from additional what we call producers surplus, which is this gray area here. This is going to actually be a little bit, actually quite a bit better than what the subsidizing domestic supply would do. It's going to achieve both of the aims, which is that we're going to get the right amount of imports from China, and we're going to get the right amount of total consumption. The other thing you can do is you can impose a quota. The quota essentially does the same thing, but the additional revenue goes to the importers and not the government. So this just becomes a question of who wants to take home the revenue that's created when you start to muck around with trade. Okay, so I think I've got time for questions. Yeah, I've got time for questions. Breeze through the economics pretty quickly, so if happy to take any questions now.
Be the first question, Charles.
Ah, shoot.
Yeah. So I take it, I've heard this from other sources too, by the way. The shop that Dave runs, we're doing a job for guys who are in the business. They're thinking about becoming participants in the business of producing rare earths, and this idea that the Chinese have this cudgel that they may use, they may deploy against any newly launched processing firm. We've heard this from them, and so, you know, putting aside the kind of the malevolent backstory there, the real issue, I guess, for the new milling operation is this idea that they might get knocked out of the market by the flooding of the market phenomenon. So,
Are you saying you don't buy that argument, or?
no, I'm just setting up.
Okay.
I don't know why that's any different from, say, a nuclear power plant that's worried about having electricity prices tank because you've got wind power flooding the market in the middle of the day, or similarly, a wind turbine worried about having prices tank for some other kind of a reason. And the way that both of those enterprises address that kind of uncertainty is through a purchase power agreement. So my question is, why doesn't the government just set up a stockpile and guarantee the millers a steady source of demand in the event that the Chinese flood the market, which has all kinds of benefits, not least of which is the strategic effect that it makes it kind of, it cuts the legs out of this Chinese threat to flood the market.
So like an offtake agreement, right?
Yep. Just like that.
I think they are. I think that's what they're trying to set up.
Okay, but if that's in place, then it seems like all of those concerns about the milling operations get either minimized or removed.
Well, they just get shifted onto the federal government, I guess, right? That the federal government now is internalizing the risk that comes from playing hardball with China.
Are we talking about more than 0.1% of the government budget?
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no,
So
I
if
think
we really
that's
care
right.
about this is like cheap insurance.
This is cheap insurance for now. I guess the question becomes, how does it stay cheap if demand continues to increase in the future? Hard to say, right? But I think right now this is cheap insurance. If you can get the producers online and you can guarantee that they're going to stay online, then you're playing catch up, right? I've had similar talks with folks who do trade agreements all the time, and they're like, well, you basically are now, China is now basically trying to force you to say that you want to break up what is essentially a natural monopoly at this point. And then the question becomes, how do you do that? Traditionally, we wouldn't want to break up a natural monopoly if we just want to regulate that natural monopoly, but we can't do that in this case. So how do you break it up? It would be through these offtake agreements, at least in the short term. What happens after that, if demand starts to increase and it starts to become these things become as important as oil, then maybe that's a different thing, because I don't know that we could continue to guarantee offtake agreements for oil if rare earths were playing that large of a percentage in our GDP. But to your point, I think now the short-term answer is to put in these offtake agreements. We didn't consider that here, only because it didn't fit nicely into my pretty demand and supply curve. But we can easily think about how the security premium would fit into thinking about how to structure those offtake agreements. Yeah.
Great presentation. Quick question on enforcement. So if you put a premium on rare earth elements, I guess, what are the rules for enforcement, like certificates of production, basically brokers moving rare earth elements across international lines, reselling them with a different brand? Is that a part of the equation? Is that a cost associated with implementation of this?
Certainly a cost associated with implementation. As we've seen now with trying to regulate the trade in Russian oil and natural gas, it gets tricky. So I think that those concerns would still be here. The fact that China could simply just ship stuff to another country and mask somehow that it's coming from China is a big concern. The other concern, obviously, is that a lot of the mining that's going on in these other rest of the world countries that I was talking about is actually being fronted by China. So I say it's rest of the world. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not being touched by China. We have been trying to work with some trade economists to figure out if we can dig into the trade data and determine which of those countries have ownership that could be tied back to China. This is a thing a bunch of people are trying to do. But that would allow us to go back and do a little more refining of what does the rest of the world look like. Because it could be that there's a mine in Brazil that we're calling rest of the world, but it's actually 99% owned by China, right? And so we could then go through and do a little bit better of handling that. But at this point, we haven't been able to get a firm grasp on how much Chinese influence is showing up in those rest of the world. And then, of course, as you said, the enforcement becomes a much more difficult issue if you're moving the rare earths around and moving them onto different boats and changing. But I think that enforcement issue is something that shows up in almost any other energy resource anytime we try to put economic sanctions on a country, right? I don't know that it would be different. It's still a challenge. I don't know that it'd be different. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about the environmental costs, and no, we didn't include the environmental cost in those supply elasticities for the rest of the world. We looked at how they responded production-wise when there was the price spikes that we saw in the recent decades, right? So that's all just how they responded, and it sort of depends on how much their country is willing to take on those environmental costs. This is something I want to think more about, because obviously we offshore environmentally nasty production processes all the time, and we don't care, right? And so if China wasn't angry at us, we would say we screwed China, right? We basically shipped this really nasty production process to China and let them deal with it. But now we are thinking about it completely differently, and we want to move those things back, right? I think the environmental externalities are going to come into play here, because if you factor those things in, then we don't want to move back as much as we're talking about, or at least we want to ship it over to other countries. And I think this is why you have started to hear less about increasing domestic production of these things and more of the fringe shoring ideas, that we recognize that it's going to be super hard to permit a separations facility in the United States. Davin's in the room, he's already thinking about how to do this. So it's not that it's impossible, but it would be a lot easier to do in other countries, I think, is the thought. And so we'll do fringe shoring, which just means that we're going to let other friendly countries do this instead of doing it here. I would love to factor in those environmental externalities into this. The thing I still don't have a good grasp on is what they look like. Since most of the production is going on in China, we don't have good data on how nasty this stuff really is. We're working with folks at Oak Ridge National Lab who have what they call a medium scale facility, which just basically means that it's not bench scale. It's not in the lab. It's actually run out of a storage facility. So it's not exactly the biggest production facility in the world, but it's bigger than lab scale. And we're basically trying to figure out how nasty is that process at that small scale, but that's probably not going to be a very good representation of what it looks like when you scale it up. The other thing that I will say to that is that there's lots of effort to try to figure out how to do this more in a more environmentally sound manner. There are all alternatives to this. The reason this is so nasty, right, is that, I mean, I'm going to overly simplify this as an economist, but you're sitting here with a giant rock, and really all you need out of that rock is you only need like 0.001% of the mass of that rock, right? And so you're using separations, chemical processes at high pressures to strip off the stuff you don't need, which means you've got 99.99% now of chemically tainted waste that has to get disposed of. And the stuff's just really nasty. They are trying to figure out ways that you could do that with magnets and through biochemical processes. So we have bacteria that basically eats off everything else and leaves you with what you want. That would be a more environmentally sound way to do it. I think one of the ways that we could potentially do this is by saying that we will we've talked about this, it's sort of the diamond scenario, right? Is that if you can, we have loads of countries who have guaranteed that they're not going to buy blood diamonds from countries that don't produce diamonds in an environmentally sound way. You could essentially do the same thing with rare earths, right? You could say that we're going to require that the production of rare earths be handled through one of these alternative methods. The United States or another friendly country has got the market cornered on that production process, and then maybe that's how you start to claw back some market share and break that natural monopoly, is potentially through the nasty environmental externalities that the Chinese have sort of leveraged to grab that market share to begin with. But more than one, less than 200. How about that, right? It's a massive ballpark, but I really don't have any idea. But it's certainly more than one. I mean, it is what, if you believe what you hear, it is what has made, between the environmental externalities and the labor issues. If you look online, they'll show pretty nasty ways that they're doing this, where people are just handling this stuff. I mean, a lot of the mining in these other countries is pretty damaging for people as well, but it's certainly a big issue because it's given them the advantage that these other rest of the world countries can't have. We had a colleague who's at who's in the UK who's been thinking about this, and he's been trying to tease out these supply elasticities in different countries by looking at, basically adding in another covariate in that to look at environmental regulations in the country. So Vietnam's environmental regulations are more lax than Brazil's. Can you use that to tease out what is the comparative advantage of having more lax environmental standards? But we don't have a good number on it yet.
What about what happens if China takes over Taiwan in effect to rare earth minerals?
I try not to. No, I haven't thought a lot. What's your angle?
So if they end up taking over Taiwan, that they take over the chip industry, right? Because that's where all the chips come from. So you also have the rare earth minerals, and then they have attachment to that as well. So won't that increase the cost of everything? And they also have a monopoly over that as well.
Possibly. Haven't thought as much about that. We've been thinking more about the fact that they. So I'll maybe I'll circle back to your answer. We have been thinking a little bit about, as I said, that why are they selling these things so cheap? Why are they continuing to kind of pollute the northwestern portion of their country by doing these separation processes? It's the reason is because they want to get those downstream markets, right? And so you could argue that if that's the same idea and that rare earths are becoming important in the chip making process, then maybe they're thinking that they're going to go about by grabbing that downstream market through some sort of military action. But to answer your question no, I haven't thought too much about the chip angle.
Yeah, questions online?
Okay, it's on now. Well, thank you, Dr. Sims. You'd please join me in thanking Charles for his time today. SCR has a gift bag for you to bribe you into speaking again after some of these market
Thank you.
changes take place.
Thank you.
So, thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
And then before you all leave, our next presentation is next Friday at noon. It's part of our Energy Day celebration. So we are sponsoring the football game next Saturday. But our next week's presentation will be Wyoming Superintendent of Public Instruction, Megan Degenfelder, who will talk about the intersection of energy and education in Wyoming. So please join us. Thanks.